There is something I want to say in a way that I almost never do, because this subject deserves complete honesty. If I softened the language, it would weaken the truth behind what I am trying to explain. What we are about to explore is not the familiar idea of justice, where someone who caused pain eventually receives a perfectly balanced consequence, making everything feel fair again. Real life is rarely that simple. What actually happens is far more complicated, and in many ways far more believable. This is about the inner psychological experience of an avoidant after they deeply hurt someone whose love quietly became one of the most meaningful parts of their life, even if they never openly admitted it. Even when their actions suggested distance instead of attachment, that person often occupied a far greater place in their emotional world than they consciously realized. When I use the word betrayal, I am not talking only about obvious acts that everyone immediately recognizes. I am also talking about the quieter forms of betrayal that leave invisible scars. It is pulling away when someone desperately needed closeness. It is choosing silence when reassurance was necessary. It is creating a cycle of warmth and distance that gives someone hope, only to slowly take it away again. It is accepting deep, wholehearted love without offering the same emotional investment in return. These experiences are betrayals, even if the avoidant never intended them to be. In many cases, they do not even recognize what they have done, and that lack of awareness is one of the most important parts of this conversation. The person on the receiving end feels those moments deeply, not just emotionally, but physically and psychologically. Those experiences leave lasting marks, while inside the avoidant, a much slower and less visible process quietly begins to unfold. Before we can understand what eventually happens inside an avoidant, we first have to understand why they were so unaware in the first place. Their blindness was not a small detail in the story. It was the very reason everything unfolded the way it did. They did not realize that hurting you would eventually create consequences they could never predict, because they never truly understood what your presence meant to them. This was not because they consciously decided you were unimportant, or because they intentionally dismissed your value. Instead, it came from the way avoidant attachment reshapes perception. It causes them to underestimate the importance of a meaningful connection while they still have it, and at the same time, it convinces them that losing it will not affect them as much as it actually will. This is one of the most painful paradoxes of avoidant psychology. The same emotional defenses that protect them from the fear of loss also prevent them from fully appreciating what they possess before it disappears. The walls that keep painful emotions outside also block the deeper awareness of love, security, and emotional significance from fully entering. As a result, an avoidant can experience something truly rare and meaningful without recognizing just how extraordinary it is until much later. Because of this distorted perception, the avoidant makes decisions without fully understanding what is truly at stake. Every withdrawal, every moment of emotional distance, every failure to show up consistently, and every betrayal, whether obvious or subtle, happens while they are missing critical emotional information. They believe they are walking away from something they can always revisit later if they choose. They assume the relationship can survive repeated neglect, emotional inconsistency, or prolonged distance without permanently changing. They convince themselves that the connection will always be available whenever they feel ready to reconnect. What they fail to see is that some relationships cannot be endlessly tested without consequences. Some forms of love are completely irreplaceable, and once they are damaged beyond repair, no amount of later understanding can restore them to what they once were. Their own attachment system actively hides this reality from them, making the emotional cost almost impossible to recognize while they still have the opportunity to protect what matters most. By the time that understanding finally begins to emerge, the opportunity to make different choices is often already gone. What makes this process even more significant is that the real consequences almost never arrive immediately. They appear much later, after enough time has passed for the avoidant's protective defenses to slowly weaken. That delay changes everything because it allows the emotional impact to grow beneath the surface without being fully acknowledged. Right after the relationship ends, after the distance has been created, or after the damage has already been done, the avoidant's defense mechanisms become especially active. Their mind immediately begins doing what it has always been trained to do. It minimizes painful emotions, reorganizes uncomfortable memories, and creates explanations that make everything seem easier to live with. These unconscious strategies protect the avoidant from emotional overwhelm and preserve the identity they have built around staying emotionally independent. From the outside, this period often looks like complete indifference. It appears as though they moved on effortlessly, unaffected by what happened. For the person left behind, this can be one of the most heartbreaking experiences imaginable because it creates the painful belief that the relationship never truly mattered to the avoidant at all. Yet this is one of the biggest misunderstandings in avoidant relationship dynamics. What appears to be emotional freedom is often a temporary psychological defense, not an accurate reflection of what is happening beneath the surface. What often looks like emotional detachment is rarely true indifference. More often, it is an emotional defense operating at its highest capacity. The avoidant is unconsciously using every psychological strategy available to keep themselves from feeling the full impact of what happened and what was lost. Their calm exterior is not proof that the relationship meant little. It is evidence that they are holding themselves together by keeping painful emotions locked beneath the surface. At that stage, they cannot afford to fully experience the consequences because doing so would shake the very coping mechanisms that allow them to function. But those defenses are not endless. Eventually, reality becomes stronger than suppression. The turning point almost always arrives when they are confronted with undeniable proof that the person they once believed would always remain within reach has genuinely built a life without them. It is no longer the temporary distance they imagined they could reverse whenever they were ready. Instead, they face a permanent absence that quietly announces the chapter has truly ended. Sometimes, that realization comes simply from recognizing that you are no longer emotionally available, not because you are trying to prove a point or make them jealous, but because you have sincerely moved forward. The emotional energy that once revolved around them has been redirected into your own healing, growth, and peace. You are no longer waiting for them to change or return. Your life has found its own rhythm, and your happiness is no longer connected to their choices. Other times, the realization comes from seeing a completely transformed version of you, whether through a brief encounter, a mutual friend, or even something as small as a photograph. They see someone who appears calmer, stronger, more confident, and more comfortable within themselves. The quiet self-respect that slowly developed after the relationship now becomes impossible to ignore. Unlike before, this version of you reaches past all the emotional filters that once protected them. It forces them to confront a reality they can no longer reinterpret or minimize. In that moment, the psychological reckoning truly begins, and it is far deeper than most people imagine. What happens next is not dramatic in the way movies often portray regret. It is much more subtle, but also much more powerful. The first stage happens inside their thinking. They begin seeing the relationship with a level of clarity that was unavailable to them while they were living it. For the first time, they recognize the true value of what they had and the role their own actions played in losing it. This is not simple nostalgia or selective memory. It is a sharp shift in perception that arrives after months or even years of emotional suppression. Because those realizations were delayed for so long, they emerge with enormous intensity once the psychological barriers weaken. The version of you they had quietly reduced in their mind is replaced by the real person you always were. They begin remembering your emotional depth, your consistency, your compassion, and the rare way you understood parts of them they barely understood themselves. They finally recognize that your patience was never a sign of weakness, but an extraordinary expression of strength and commitment that few people would have offered. As that clearer understanding develops, another layer becomes even harder to escape. They are no longer simply appreciating your value, they are forced to recognize their own responsibility. This is very different from casually admitting they made mistakes. It becomes an emotional awareness that reaches much deeper than logic. With enough time and enough undeniable evidence, they begin seeing each moment with painful accuracy. They remember every opportunity when they could have stayed emotionally present, but instead chose distance. They replay the conversations where reassurance was needed, yet silence became their response. They notice the repeated cycle they created without fully understanding it, at the time, moving closer whenever they feared losing you, then pulling away the moment true intimacy became possible. They see how they gave just enough affection to keep hope alive, while withholding the emotional openness that real partnership required. What once felt justified now appears as a pattern that slowly damaged the very connection they secretly depended on, leaving them to face the difficult truth that many of their greatest losses were created by the defenses they believed were protecting them. Eventually, they begin seeing every moment with a clarity that was impossible before. They recognize how often you responded with kindness when they offered distance, how many times you chose understanding instead of resentment, and how patiently you carried the emotional weight of the relationship without receiving the same effort in return. They realize that your compassion was never something they earned, yet you gave it freely anyway. They also see that they failed to value it while they still had the chance. That awareness creates a profound sense of shame, one that reaches far beyond simple regret. It is not only about realizing they made mistakes, it is about recognizing that someone loved them with remarkable sincerity, and they responded from fear instead of courage. For many avoidants, this becomes one of the most emotionally painful realizations they will ever experience, because it forces them to face a version of themselves they spent years avoiding. When I say that this betrayal can ruin an avoidant's life, I do not mean that everything around them suddenly falls apart. Their career may continue, their routines may remain intact, and from the outside they may appear perfectly successful. The consequence is far quieter than that, but often much more enduring. What is lost is not simply the relationship. They lose access to a version of themselves that only existed because of the connection they shared with you. Around your presence, parts of them were slowly becoming more open, more emotionally alive, and more authentic. Your patience, encouragement, and steady love gently invited qualities out of them that their defenses had kept hidden for years. That growth was never created by them alone. It depended on the unique emotional space the relationship provided. Through repeated moments of withdrawal, avoidance, and emotional betrayal, they gradually destroyed the very environment that allowed those healthier parts of themselves to emerge. What remains afterward is not truly the life they had before meeting you. It is often a smaller version of it. Before the relationship, they could not miss what they had never experienced. After losing it, they carry the knowledge of what was possible, and that knowledge changes everything. The independence they once celebrated no longer feels completely satisfying. In quieter moments, it can begin to feel more like emotional limitation than freedom. The self-contained identity they worked so hard to protect now carries an awareness that genuine closeness once existed, and that they were unable to sustain it. They remember what it felt like to be deeply understood, accepted, and emotionally supported, and ordinary connections may struggle to reach that same depth. This does not necessarily overwhelm them every day, but it quietly becomes part of their emotional landscape. It appears in unexpected moments, in relationships that never quite feel complete, in evenings that seem strangely empty, and in private reflections they quickly push aside because they are too uncomfortable to fully explore. There is another consequence that deserves equal attention. The betrayal changes not only what they lost, but also who they gradually become. Our lives are shaped by the choices we repeatedly make during our most important moments. People are absolutely capable of meaningful growth and genuine transformation, but our repeated decisions also strengthen certain psychological patterns. Every time an avoidant chooses emotional protection instead of vulnerability, those defenses become a little easier to rely on the next time. Every moment they retreat, instead of staying emotionally present, reinforces the habit of withdrawal. Every relationship where fear wins over openness makes authentic connection feel slightly more unfamiliar. Over time, the distance between the person they truly are and the protective identity they present to the world quietly grows. The betrayal does not simply end one relationship. It strengthens the very defenses that created the loss, making future intimacy increasingly difficult unless they consciously choose to break those deeply established patterns. Because of that, the life they continue living may appear completely stable from the outside. They may function well, succeed professionally, maintain friendships, and look emotionally composed. Avoidants are often highly capable of creating lives that seem organized and successful. Yet beneath that appearance exists a private awareness that is difficult to escape. They know that something deeply meaningful was offered to them, and that they were unable to fully receive it. They know a genuine opportunity existed for emotional growth, deeper intimacy, and a more authentic version of themselves, but they walked away from it because fear felt safer than vulnerability. That understanding does not always stay in the foreground of their mind, but it quietly influences how they experience future relationships and how they understand themselves. Whenever moments of honest self-reflection break through the defenses they have spent years maintaining. As we come to the end of this discussion, I want to encourage you to focus on something more valuable than the idea of justice. It is completely understandable if part of you feels relieved, knowing that your pain was not meaningless, and that the person who hurt you is not simply living without emotional consequences. That realization can bring comfort, and there is nothing wrong with acknowledging it. But if you stop there, your attention remains centered on them rather than on your own healing. The most important part of this story has never been what happened inside the avoidant. It has been what has been happening inside you all along. While they relied on emotional defenses, you have been facing the reality of your pain directly. You have allowed yourself to grieve, reflect, grow, and slowly rebuild without hiding behind emotional distance. That process has strengthened your character, instead of weakening it. Your ability to love with honesty, accountability, and emotional courage has not disappeared because of what happened. It has become stronger through everything you endured. The avoidant never understood what they were risking, because the wounds driving their behavior prevented them from seeing the true value of the connection while it still existed. By the time that understanding finally arrived, the opportunity to protect it had already slipped away. They were making life-changing decisions without fully understanding what those decisions truly meant. They acted from a place where fear clouded perception, treating something deeply valuable as though it could always be recovered later. What deserved honesty, awareness, and emotional courage was handled through confusion, distance, and self-protection instead. The consequences of those choices did not disappear when the relationship ended. They became part of the avoidant's inner world, quietly shaping how they experience themselves long after the temporary comfort of withdrawal has faded. The emotional relief created by building walls was always temporary, but the cost of maintaining those walls became lasting. That reality is important because it reminds you that your experience mattered, what happened between you was real, and the emotional consequences did not exist only on your side of the relationship. You deserve to know that the impact reached far beyond the moment everything fell apart. But even more important than what happened inside them is what happened inside you. While they were protecting themselves from difficult emotions, you were doing the much harder work of facing them. Through heartbreak, uncertainty, disappointment, and grief, you slowly built something that no one could have handed to you. You developed self-respect that no longer depends on another person's approval. You found an inner confidence that is rooted in your own character rather than someone else's ability to recognize your value. You came to understand that your capacity to love deeply is not a weakness, but one of your greatest strengths, and that you deserve a relationship where that love is returned with the same consistency, honesty, and commitment. None of that growth happened by accident. It was not simply an unexpected outcome of your pain. It became the most meaningful part of your journey, transforming the experience from something that only wounded you into something that also revealed your own strength. The avoidant entered the relationship without fully appreciating what they had, and because of that blindness, they made choices that slowly destroyed something truly rare. In losing you, they also lost the opportunity to continue becoming the version of themselves your love had quietly encouraged. Your presence created a space where they could have grown beyond old defenses and discovered a more authentic way of living, but they were unable to recognize that opportunity until it was no longer available. You, however, experienced a very different outcome. Even though you endured the confusion, the emotional distance, the silence, and the exhausting process of healing, you did not lose the most important part of yourself. Instead, you found it. You discovered a deeper understanding of your own worth, clearer boundaries, greater emotional wisdom, and a stronger connection to who you truly are. That growth did not erase the pain, but it gave the pain a purpose that reached far beyond the relationship itself. That is why this story is ultimately not about the avoidant's regret. It is about your transformation. Their greatest loss was the connection they failed to value until it was gone. Your greatest gain was discovering that your identity was never dependent on someone else's ability to choose you. The confidence you have built, the emotional clarity you have earned, and the understanding that you deserve to be loved, with the same openness and devotion that you freely give to others, are now permanent parts of who you are. No one can take those away from you. They cannot be undone by another person's fear, distance, or inability to receive love. They belong entirely to you because you built them through your own courage and resilience. In the end, that is the only lasting victory that truly matters. Relationships can begin and end, people can leave, and opportunities can be lost, but the person you became through the experience remains with you forever. That is the one thing no betrayal can ever destroy, and it is the only outcome that was truly worth fighting for. If there is one final thought I want to leave you with, it is this. Do not make the mistake of believing that your story reaches its conclusion the moment the avoidant realizes what they lost. That realization, if it comes, belongs to their journey, not yours. It is a chapter in their psychological experience, but it was never meant to become the destination of your healing. Too many people unknowingly place their emotional freedom on hold while waiting for someone else to understand the value of what they walked away from. They tell themselves they will finally feel at peace when the avoidant regrets their choices, when they apologize, when they come back, or when life eventually teaches them the lesson they refused to learn during the relationship. But if your healing depends on their awakening, then your peace is still living inside their decisions. That means your emotional future remains connected to someone who has already shown you they were unable to carry that responsibility. Real healing asks for something entirely different. It asks you to take your life back before they ever understand what they lost. It asks you to stop making your future dependent on their level of awareness, because whether they eventually see the truth or never fully face it at all, your opportunity to build a meaningful, peaceful, deeply fulfilling life exists right now. The moment you stop measuring your progress by what is happening inside them is the moment your own transformation accelerates in ways you could never have imagined. One of the greatest misconceptions about heartbreak is that the goal is to stop loving the person who hurt you. In reality, healing is rarely that simple. Love does not disappear because someone disappointed you. Feelings do not vanish on command simply because logic tells you they should. What changes is not always the presence of love, but the place it occupies inside your life. At first, it may feel like the center of everything. Every memory pulls at you. Every unanswered question demands an explanation. Every quiet moment reminds you of what could have been. But slowly, almost without noticing, something begins to shift. The relationship stops defining your identity. Their choices stop defining your value. Their inability to meet you where you stood no longer becomes evidence that you asked for too much. Instead, you begin seeing the relationship through a clearer lens. You recognize that loving someone deeply does not automatically make them capable of receiving that love. You understand that another person's emotional limitations are not proof that your heart was too open. They are simply evidence that two people can care about each other while existing at very different levels of emotional readiness. That realization is painful, but it is also incredibly liberating because it frees you from carrying responsibility for a battle that was never yours to fight. The truth is that relationships reveal us. They expose the parts of ourselves that still need healing, the fears we have never fully addressed, and the strengths we never knew we possessed. That is true for the avoidant, and it is equally true for you. Their avoidance revealed the walls they built long before they met you. Your response to that experience revealed something equally important. It revealed your resilience. It revealed your capacity to survive disappointment without allowing disappointment to become your identity. It revealed your ability to continue choosing honesty even after someone else responded with distance. Most importantly, it revealed that your greatest strength was never convincing another person to stay. Your greatest strength was learning that you could remain connected to yourself even after someone else walked away. That lesson reaches far beyond this relationship. It changes the way you choose future partners. It changes the boundaries you set. It changes the conversations you tolerate and the behaviors you no longer excuse. You stop chasing emotional inconsistency because you finally understand that peace is more valuable than emotional uncertainty. You stop confusing potential with commitment. You stop believing that patience alone can heal someone who is unwilling to confront their own fears. Those are not small changes. They are the foundation of a completely different future. Perhaps the most beautiful part of this entire journey is that the person you become after genuine healing is someone you could not have become without walking through the pain. That does not mean the betrayal was good. It does not justify what happened. It does not suggest that suffering is necessary for growth. What it means is that once the pain arrived, you refused to let it be meaningless. You allowed it to teach you instead of defining you. You allowed it to refine your standards instead of lowering them. You allowed it to deepen your compassion without sacrificing your boundaries. You learned that forgiveness, if it ever comes, is not permission for someone to return unchanged. It is permission for you to stop carrying the weight of what they chose. You learned that closure is not something another person hands to you during one perfect conversation. Closure is built quietly through the hundreds of ordinary days when you continue choosing yourself, even when part of you still misses them. It is created every time you refuse to betray your own needs in order to hold on to someone who continually betrayed them.